The clock on Officer Blake's dashboard showed 7:43 p.m. as he cruised down the busy streets of London. Rush hour traffic was finally starting to thin out, but the roads were still packed with people trying to get home after a long day at work. Blake had been a police officer for 8 years now, and he'd seen just about everything you could imagine. Drug dealers, drunk drivers, car thieves, people having mental breakdowns, you name it, he dealt with it. Tonight felt like any other. Evening shift until he spotted something unusual. A black sedan, expensive looking, was weaving slightly between lanes about 50 meters ahead of him. It wasn't aggressive driving, more like the driver was distracted or maybe tired. Blake had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and something about this car caught his attention. He pressed the accelerator and moved closer to get a better look. The car wasn't speeding, wasn't running red lights, but there was definitely something off about how it was moving. The driver seemed to be looking around a lot, checking mirrors constantly, almost like he was nervous about something. Blake had pulled over hundreds of nervous drivers before. Sometimes they were hiding drugs, sometimes they had warrants, and sometimes they were just having a bad day. Blake flicked on his blue lights and followed the standard procedure. The sedan's brake lights came on immediately, and the driver pulled over to the curb without any drama. That was a good sign, at least. People who were planning to run usually didn't stop so easily. As Blake parked his patrol car behind the sedan, he took a moment to call in the license plate number to dispatch. While he waited for the response, he studied the car more carefully. It was a newer model, well-maintained, with government-style license plates. Nothing obviously suspicious, but Blake had learned that the most interesting traffic stops often started with the most ordinary-looking vehicles. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out into the cool London evening. The street was busy enough that a few pedestrians had already started to slow down and watch. Blake was used to having an audience during traffic stops. Everyone had a phone these days, and everyone thought they might witness something worth posting online. Walking up to the driver's side window, Blake immediately noticed something that made him pause. The man behind the wheel was wearing what looked like a military uniform, but not just any uniform. This was elaborate stuff, deep navy blue fabric with gold braiding, shiny buttons, and patches that looked official. The kind of thing you might see in a movie about the royal family. The driver was a middle-aged man, probably in his 50s, with gray hair cut in a precise military style. His posture was perfectly straight, even sitting down, and he had the kind of bearing that suggested he was used to being in charge. When he rolled down his window, Blake could see his expression was somewhere between annoyed and impatient. "Good evening, sir," Blake said, keeping his tone professional but friendly. "I pulled you over because I noticed you were drifting between lanes back there. Nothing too serious, but I wanted to make sure everything's okay. Have you been drinking tonight, or are you feeling unwell?" The man's response came in a crisp, formal accent that sounded like something from a period drama. "Officer, I am Captain Whitmore of Her Majesty's Household Division. I have just concluded ceremonial duties and am returning to my residence. I can assure you that I have consumed no alcohol this evening." Blake had to resist the urge to chuckle. In his 8 years on the force, he'd heard every excuse imaginable. People claimed to be doctors rushing to emergencies, lawyers heading to important meetings, even celebrities trying to get to concerts. But this was a new one. The man was either a very committed actor or genuinely believed he was some kind of royal guard. The uniform did look impressive, though. Blake had to admit that whoever had put this costume together had done their homework. The fabric looked expensive, the stitching was precise, and those medals and patches looked like they came from a serious military surplus store. But London was full of people who dressed up for historical reenactments, costume parties, and tourist photos. Just last month, Blake had pulled over a guy dressed as a Viking who claimed he was late for a museum event. "I see," Blake said, trying to keep the skepticism out of his voice. "Sir, I'm going to need to see your driver's license and vehicle registration, please." As Captain Whitmore reached toward his jacket pocket, Blake's attention was drawn to the passenger seat of the car. Lying there, secured with what looked like a custom mount, was an ornate sword. Not a cheap replica either. This thing looked like it belonged in a museum. The blade was covered by an elaborate scabbard decorated with gold fittings and what appeared to be precious stones. Blake's hand instinctively moved closer to his radio. Weapons in vehicles always required extra caution, even if they looked ceremonial. "Sir, I can see you have a sword in your vehicle. Can you tell me about that?" "It is my ceremonial blade," Whitmore replied matter-of-factly, as if carrying around medieval weapons was the most normal thing in the world. Standard equipment for officers of the Household Division during formal duties. While Whitmore searched for his license, Blake got a better look at the car's interior. The dashboard was covered with official-looking documents, some bearing what appeared to be government seals. There were folders marked with security classifications and what looked like building blueprints or floor plans. Either this guy was the most dedicated cosplayer in London, or there was more to this story than Blake initially thought. The radio crackled to life in Blake's earpiece. Dispatch confirmed that the license plate came back clean, registered to a James Whitmore at an address in central London. No outstanding warrants, no reports of the vehicle being stolen. But that didn't really prove anything about the man's claims of being a royal guard. "Mr. Whitmore," Blake said, "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle, please. I want to have a proper conversation about what you've got in your car." Whitmore's military posture somehow became even more rigid. "Officer, I must respectfully inform you that I am currently in possession of classified government documents. My duties this evening involved matters of national security, and I am not at liberty to discuss the specifics of my assignment." Blake had definitely never heard that one before. He dealt with people claiming to have secret clearances, usually right before he found their stash of illegal substances. But something about Whitmore's tone was different. The man wasn't panicking or making excuses. He was stating facts in the same way he might report the weather. "Sir, please step out of the car," Blake repeated, his voice taking on a more authoritative tone. "Keep your hands where I can see them." By now, the small crowd of pedestrians had grown into a decent-sized audience. A few people had their phones out, probably live streaming or recording for social media. Blake hoped this wouldn't turn into one of those viral videos where the police officer looked like an idiot, but he had a job to do regardless of who might be watching. Whitmore complied with the request, moving with the precise, controlled movements of someone with military training. Standing next to his car, he cut an impressive figure in his elaborate uniform. Blake had to admit that if this was a costume, it was incredibly convincing. The man even stood at attention like a soldier, with his chin up and shoulders back. "Now, sir," Blake said, "I need you to explain to me exactly what you're doing driving around London with a sword and a car full of what you claim are government documents. And please keep it simple. I've had a long day." Captain Whitmore stood perfectly still beside his car, his hands clasped behind his back in a military posture that looked like second nature to him. Blake could see the man was trying to stay calm, but there was definitely tension building in his jaw. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, and Blake could hear whispers and comments from people trying to figure out what was happening. "Officer," Whitmore began, his voice maintaining that same formal tone, "I understand your position, but I must stress that this situation is more complex than it appears. I have spent this evening at Buckingham Palace attending a classified briefing regarding upcoming ceremonial events. The documents in my possession contain sensitive information about royal security arrangements." Blake had heard a lot of creative stories over the years, but this one was definitely in the top 10 for originality. He glanced back at his patrol car, considering whether he should call for backup. The sword alone was enough to make this more than a routine traffic stop, and all this talk about Buckingham Palace and classified documents was raising red flags. "Sir, I appreciate your creativity," Blake said, "but I'm going to need some real proof of who you are and what you're doing. Anyone can put on a fancy uniform and make up stories about working for the Queen." Whitmore's expression shifted slightly, showing the first real sign of frustration. "Officer Blake," he said, reading the name tag, "I am not making up stories. I am Captain James Whitmore, and I have served Her Majesty for over 20 years. The uniform I wear is not a costume. It is earned through years of dedicated service. Blake walked around to get a better look at the passenger seat, keeping one eye on Whitmore the whole time. The sword was definitely real, he could tell that much just from looking at it. The craftsmanship was incredible, with detailed engravings along the blade guard and what looked like genuine gemstones set into the handle. If this was a fake, someone had spent serious money making it look authentic. The documents scattered across the dashboard were equally impressive. Blake could see official-looking letterheads, government seals, and what appeared to be architectural drawings of some kind of large building. There were also several photographs that looked like they might be surveillance images, though he couldn't make out the details from where he stood. "Sir, I'm going to need to search your vehicle," Blake announced, "and I'm calling for backup to help sort this out." Just as Blake reached for his radio, another police car pulled up behind his patrol vehicle. Officer Riley stepped out, Blake's usual partner when things got complicated. Riley was a veteran cop with 15 years on the force, and he had a talent for dealing with unusual situations. Blake had never been happier to see him. "What have we got here, Blake?" Riley asked as he approached, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. The fancy uniform, the growing crowd, and Blake's slightly confused expression told him this wasn't a typical traffic stop. "This gentleman claims to be Captain Whitmore of the Queen's Guard," Blake explained. "Says he's been at Buckingham Palace on classified business. He's got a sword in the car and a bunch of official-looking documents." Riley walked over to where Whitmore stood and studied him carefully. The captain met his gaze without flinching, maintaining his military bearing despite the obviously stressful situation. Riley had dealt with enough fake officials over the years to develop a sense for when someone was putting on an act, and something about this man seemed different. "Captain Whitmore," Riley said. "I'm Officer Riley. Can you provide us with some identification that proves your military position?" Whitmore nodded and slowly reached into his jacket pocket, making sure both officers could see his movements. He pulled out a leather wallet and extracted what appeared to be a military identification card. The card looked official enough, with Whitmore's photograph, various security features, and text that neither officer could completely understand. Riley examined the ID carefully, looking for signs that it might be fake. The printing quality was excellent. The photograph matched the man standing in front of them, and there were security features that would be difficult to duplicate. But Riley had seen some incredibly convincing fake IDs before, especially from people involved in elaborate cons. "This looks pretty good," Riley admitted, "but we're going to need to verify this through official channels. Anyone can get fake IDs made these days." The crowd around them was getting more interested by the minute. Someone had recognized the uniform style and was explaining to their friends that it looked like the kind worn by the guards at Buckingham Palace. A few people were taking photos and videos, probably posting them to social media with captions about seeing a real royal guard getting arrested. Whitmore's frustration was becoming more visible now. "Officers, I understand your skepticism, but I must insist that you contact the Household Division immediately. This situation is becoming quite serious, and my commanding officer needs to be informed that I have been detained while carrying classified materials." Blake was starting to feel a bit out of his depth. If this guy was telling the truth, Blake had just pulled over someone who worked directly for the royal family. If he was lying, then he was putting on one hell of a performance. Either way, this was definitely above Blake's pay grade. "Look, Captain or Mr. Whitmore, whatever you prefer," Blake said. "We're going to have to take you down to the station to sort this all out. We can't just take your word for it that you're some kind of royal guard. That is absolutely unacceptable," Whitmore replied, his military training keeping his voice controlled, but Blake could hear the edge creeping in. "I am carrying time-sensitive materials that cannot be delayed. Every minute we spend here discussing this matter is a potential security risk." Riley had been examining the documents visible through the car window more carefully. Some of them definitely looked official. The paper quality was high. The printing was professional, and those government seals looked authentic. But he'd also seen con artists go to incredible lengths to create convincing fake documents. "Sir, if what you're saying is true," Riley said, "then you'll have contacts who can verify your identity quickly." We're willing to let you make a phone call to your commanding officer, but we're not letting you leave until we can confirm your story. Whitmore considered this for a moment, clearly weighing his options. The crowd was getting larger, and Blake could see more phones recording the interaction. This was exactly the kind of situation that could end up on the evening news, especially if it turned out they had actually detained a real member of the Royal Guard. "Very well," Whitmore said finally. "I will contact Colonel Morrison, my commanding officer. However, I must warn you that disturbing him at this hour regarding such a matter will have consequences that extend far beyond this street corner." Blake handed Whitmore his own phone, figuring it was safer than letting the captain use his own device, where he might delete evidence or contact accomplices if this whole thing was an elaborate scam. Whitmore accepted the phone with a slight nod of acknowledgement. As Whitmore began dialing, Blake and Riley stepped a few feet away to discuss the situation privately. They both agreed that something about this whole encounter felt different from their usual interactions with people pretending to be someone important. The man's bearing, his knowledge of military protocol, and the quality of his uniform and documents all suggested that he might actually be telling the truth, but they'd both been fooled before by convincing performances, and their job was to be suspicious of unusual claims. Neither officer wanted to end up in a situation where they let someone go who turned out to be involved in something illegal. Just because he had a fancy uniform and a good story, the phone call was about to begin, and Blake had a feeling that whatever happened next would determine whether this night ended with them looking like heroes or idiots. Captain Whitmore held Blake's phone in his hand, staring at the screen for a moment before he began dialing. The weight of his situation was becoming clearer by the minute. He was stuck between his sworn duty to protect classified information and his need to prove his identity to two police officers who had every reason to be suspicious of his story. The crowd around them had grown to about 20 people now, all keeping a respectful distance but clearly fascinated by what was unfolding. Some were still recording with their phones, and Whitmore could hear fragments of conversations as people speculated about what was happening. Someone mentioned seeing similar uniforms during the Queen's birthday parade, while another person was convinced they were watching some kind of movie being filmed. As Whitmore dialed the number, he felt the familiar weight of responsibility that had defined his entire military career. 23 years of service to the Crown had taught him that duty always came first. But tonight that duty was putting him in an impossible position. The briefing he'd attended at the palace just 2 hours earlier had covered security arrangements for an upcoming state visit. The documents in his car contained floor plans, arrival schedules, and protection details that could never be made public. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Morrison here. Colonel, this is Captain Whitmore. I apologize for disturbing you at this hour, but I have encountered a significant problem." Blake and Riley exchanged glances as they listened to one side of what sounded like a very formal military conversation. Whitmore's tone was respectful but urgent, and he was clearly speaking to someone he considered a superior officer. "Sir, I have been detained by Metropolitan Police while returning from this evening's briefing. The officers require verification of my identity and position before they will allow me to continue. I am currently in possession of the classified materials we discussed." Colonel Morrison's voice became noticeably sharper, though the officers couldn't make out his exact words. Whitmore's expression remained professional, but Blake could see the muscles in his jaw tighten as he listened to his commanding officer's response. "Yes, sir, I understand the gravity of the situation. The officers have been professional, but they require official confirmation through proper channels. I am at—" Whitmore paused and looked around for a street sign. "I am at the intersection of Kensington Road and Exhibition Road." Riley stepped closer, trying to get a better sense of whether this phone call was genuine or just an elaborate performance. He'd seen con artists make fake phone calls before, sometimes even having accomplices on the other end to play along with their stories. But something about this conversation felt different. The way Whitmore spoke, his body language, and the Obvious stress in his voice all suggested this was a real call to a real commanding officer. "Colonel, I must stress that time is of the essence," Whitmore continued. "The materials cannot remain in an unsecured location for an extended period, and I have concerns about the growing public attention this incident is attracting." Blake looked around at the crowd and realized Whitmore had a point. What had started as a simple traffic stop was turning into a spectacle. Cars were slowing down as they passed, and he could see people in nearby buildings looking out their windows to see what was happening. If this man really was carrying sensitive government documents, having them displayed on a busy London street probably wasn't ideal. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Whitmore providing details about his evening's activities and the specific nature of the materials in his possession. Blake couldn't help but notice that everything the captain said sounded consistent and detailed. Most people making up stories started to contradict themselves or provide vague answers when pressed for specifics, but Whitmore's account remained clear and precise. "Sir, the officers are Officers Blake and Riley of the Metropolitan Police," Whitmore said, reading their name tags again. "They have requested direct verification through official channels before releasing me." Colonel Morrison apparently asked to speak to one of the officers, because Whitmore turned to Blake and extended the phone. "Colonel Morrison would like to speak with you directly, Officer Blake." Blake hesitated for a moment. If this was all fake, he was about to have a very awkward conversation with someone pretending to be a British Army colonel. If it was real, he was about to speak with someone who probably outranked anyone he'd ever talked to in his life. "This is Officer Blake," he said, accepting the phone. The voice on the other end was crisp, authoritative, and clearly annoyed. "Officer Blake, I am Colonel Morrison of Her Majesty's Household Division. Captain Whitmore is under my direct command and was conducting official duties this evening at my express orders." Blake found himself unconsciously straightening his posture as he listened to the colonel's explanation. The man's voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of command experience, and his knowledge of military protocols and government procedures sounded genuine. "Sir, I understand your position," Blake replied, "but I'm sure you can appreciate that we need to verify these claims through our own channels. We've had people impersonate officials before." "Of course you have your procedures, Officer Blake, and I respect that. However, I must impress upon you the sensitive nature of Captain Whitmore's current assignment. He is carrying classified materials that relate directly to national security, and every minute of delay increases the risk of compromise." Blake could feel the situation slipping beyond his control. If this was real, he was potentially interfering with matters of national importance. If it was fake, he was being manipulated by someone with an impressive understanding of how to sound official and important. "Colonel Morrison, what can you tell me that would help us verify Captain Whitmore's identity?" "Officer Blake, I am going to provide you with a contact number for the Ministry of Defense duty officer. They will be able to confirm both my identity and Captain Whitmore's position within minutes. However, I must ask that you treat the materials in Captain Whitmore's possession with the utmost care. They are classified at the highest levels." Blake wrote down the number that Colonel Morrison provided, double-checking each digit to make sure he had it right. The colonel's tone had become more cooperative, but Blake could still hear the underlying tension. Whoever this man was, he was clearly taking the situation very seriously. "I am also dispatching additional personnel to your location," Morrison continued. "They will arrive within minutes to assist with the verification process and to ensure the security of the classified materials. I trust you will extend them full cooperation." Blake felt his stomach drop a little. Additional personnel? That sounded like this situation was about to get much more complicated. "Sir, what kind of additional personnel are we talking about?" "Military personnel, Officer Blake, members of Captain Whitmore's own unit who can provide immediate verification of his identity and assist with securing the classified materials." After ending the call, Blake handed the phone back to Whitmore and turned to Riley. Both officers were now facing a situation that was well outside their normal experience. They needed to make decisions about classified materials. Military personnel and potential matters of national security, things that definitely weren't covered in their basic police training. What do you think? Blake asked Riley quietly. Riley shook his head. I've never dealt with anything like this. But that phone call sounded pretty convincing. And look at him, he's not acting like someone who's been caught in a lie. Indeed, Whitmore seemed calmer now that he'd made contact with his commanding officer. He stood patiently by his car, occasionally checking his watch but no longer showing the frustration he'd displayed earlier. If anything, he looked like someone who knew help was on the way. The crowd was still growing, and Blake realized they needed to make some decisions quickly. Whatever was about to happen, he had a feeling. This was going to be a night he'd remember for a very long time. Blake pulled Riley aside to a spot where they could talk without being overheard by either Whitmore or the growing crowd of onlookers. The situation had gone from a simple traffic stop to something that was making both officers increasingly uncomfortable. Neither of them had dealt with anything involving national security or military personnel before, and the weight of potentially making the wrong decision was starting to sink in. "What's your gut telling you?" Blake asked his partner, keeping his voice low. Riley glanced back at Whitmore, who was now standing calmly by his vehicle, occasionally checking his watch but otherwise looking like a man who was confident help was on the way. Honestly, I'm starting to think he might be telling the truth. That phone call seemed too detailed to be fake, and look at him now. He's not panicking or trying to talk his way out of anything. He's just waiting. Blake nodded, feeling the same uncertainty. Yeah, but we've both seen good con artists before. Remember that guy last year who convinced half the department he was an undercover federal agent? He had fake badges, fake credentials, the whole thing. True, but this feels different, Riley replied. The uniform, the sword, those documents. If this is all fake, someone spent serious money putting it together. And why would someone go to all that trouble just to get out of a minor traffic violation? While the officers discussed their options, Whitmore was fighting his own internal battle. Every few minutes, he would glance at the documents visible in his car and feel a wave of anxiety about their security. The briefing papers contained details about upcoming royal events that wouldn't be announced to the public for another 2 weeks. There were floor plans of government buildings, security protocols, and even photographs of potential threat assessments. In his 23 years of military service, Whitmore had never found himself in a situation quite like this. He'd been trained to protect classified information at all costs, but he'd never considered what would happen if he needed to prove his identity to local police while carrying that information. The irony wasn't lost on him, his dedication to secrecy was now making it harder to prove he was legitimate. Blake made the decision to call the number Colonel Morrison had provided. He stepped away from the group and dialed the Ministry of Defense duty officer line, hoping someone would answer quickly. The phone rang several times before a professional-sounding woman picked up. Ministry of Defense duty office, this is Lieutenant Parker speaking. Lieutenant Parker, this is Officer Blake with the Metropolitan Police. I need to verify the identity of someone claiming to be Captain James Whitmore of Her Majesty's Household Division. There was a brief pause, and Blake could hear the sound of typing in the background. Officer Blake, can you provide me with Captain Whitmore's service number or other identifying information? Blake looked back at Whitmore and motioned for him to come over. Sir, they need your service number for verification. Whitmore approached and spoke clearly into the phone. Lieutenant Parker, this is Captain Whitmore. Service number HG447122. I am currently being detained by police while returning from classified duties. Colonel Morrison should have already contacted your office regarding this matter. More typing. Sounds came through the phone, followed by another pause. Captain Whitmore, I have your file here. Can you confirm your current assignment and the nature of tonight's duties? I attended a security briefing at Buckingham Palace regarding the upcoming state visit of the German Chancellor. The briefing concluded at 19:15 hours, and I was returning to my residence when I was stopped by police. Blake could hear the confidence in Whitmore's voice as he provided these details. Either the man was an incredible actor or he really was who he claimed to be. The lieutenant on the phone seemed satisfied with his responses. "Officer Blake," Lieutenant Parker said, "I can confirm that Captain James Whitmore is a legitimate member of Her Majesty's Household Division and was indeed assigned to attend a classified briefing this evening. Colonel Morrison has also been in contact with our office regarding this incident." Blake felt a mixture of relief and growing concern. Relief that they weren't dealing with an elaborate hoax, but concern about what this meant for how they'd handled the situation. "Lieutenant Parker, what should we do with the classified materials Captain Whitmore is carrying?" "Officer Blake, military personnel are en route to your location to assist with securing those materials. I would advise treating them with the utmost care until they arrive. Captain Whitmore should remain with his vehicle at all times." As Blake ended the call, he realized that several more people had joined the crowd of onlookers. Word was spreading through social media, and people were starting to arrive specifically to see what was happening. Someone had posted a video with the caption, "Royal Guard detained by police," and it was already being shared across multiple platforms. Riley had been monitoring police radio traffic and approached Blake with an update. "I just heard from dispatch. There are reports of military vehicles heading in this direction." Apparently, someone called it in as unusual activity. The crowd was becoming more animated now that people knew they were potentially watching a real member of the Queen's Guard. Several tourists had appeared with cameras, and Blake could see people positioning themselves to get better photos. The whole situation was turning into exactly the kind of public spectacle that classified operations were supposed to avoid. Whitmore seemed increasingly concerned about the attention they were attracting. He approached Blake with a request. "Officer Blake, I must ask that you consider moving my vehicle to a more secure location. The presence of these crowds is creating exactly the kind of security risk that our protocols are designed to prevent." Blake understood the concern, but moving the vehicle would mean moving the crime scene, which came with its own complications. "Captain Whitmore, I appreciate your position, but we need to keep everything where it is until this gets sorted out properly." "Then I respectfully request that you prevent people from photographing the documents in my vehicle," Whitmore replied. "Some of those papers contain information that could compromise ongoing security operations." Blake looked back at the car and realized that some of the documents were indeed visible through the windows, and with all the cameras now present, there was a real risk of sensitive information being captured and shared online. He called Riley over to help position their patrol cars to block the view. They worked to secure the scene. Blake noticed that Whitmore kept checking his watch and looking down the street in the same direction. When Blake asked about it, Whitmore simply said, "Military personnel value punctuality. Officer Blake, when Colonel Morrison says they'll be here in minutes, he means minutes." The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people now, and Blake was starting to worry about crowd control. Some people were getting impatient and trying to move closer to get better views. A few had started asking questions, wanting to know if this was really a member of the royal family's personal guard. Riley was fielding these questions as best he could, but the truth was that neither officer was entirely sure what they were supposed to tell people. Were they allowed to confirm that Whitmore was military? Should they be protecting his identity? These were the kinds of decisions that usually got made by supervisors, not street-level officers. Just as Blake was considering calling for additional crowd control support, he heard something that made him stop and listen carefully. In the distance, barely audible over the noise of traffic and conversation, was the sound of multiple vehicles approaching rapidly. The engines sounded different from regular cars, deeper, more powerful, like the kind of vehicles used by government agencies. Whitmore heard it too, and for the first time all evening, Blake saw him smile slightly. "That would be my colleagues, Officer Blake. I believe this situation is about to become much clearer." Blake felt his heart rate increase as the sound grew louder. Whatever was coming down that street was about to change everything, and he had a feeling that the next few minutes would determine whether this night ended with commendations or serious career consequences. The sound of engines grew louder and more distinct as 3 black Range Rovers with government license plates came into view at the end of the street. Blake felt his stomach tighten as he realized that whatever was about to happen would either vindicate their cautious approach or make them look like complete fools in front of a crowd that was now recording everything on their phones. The vehicles moved with military precision, maintaining perfect formation as they approached the scene. Blake had seen government motorcades before, but this felt different. These weren't politicians or diplomats. This was something more serious, more official. The lead vehicle had small flags mounted on the front, though Blake couldn't make out the details from this distance. As the convoy got closer, Blake could see that the windows were tinted dark enough to hide the occupants. But the way the vehicles moved suggested they contained people who were used to this kind of operation. No hesitation, no confusion about where to park. They knew exactly what they were doing. The crowd had gone almost completely silent now, sensing that something significant was about to happen. People were holding up their phones, recording what they hoped would be a moment worth sharing. Some were whispering to each other, trying to guess who might be in those official-looking vehicles. Riley moved closer to Blake and spoke quietly. Well, this is either going to be the most embarrassing moment of our careers, or we're about to meet some very important people. Blake nodded, feeling the same mixture of anticipation and dread. Either way, I don't think this is the kind of thing they covered in Police Academy. The first Range Rover came to a stop directly in front of Whitmore's sedan, followed immediately by the other two vehicles. The precision of their parking was impressive. They formed a protective barrier around the scene without blocking traffic or interfering with the police cars. These people clearly knew what they were doing. For a moment, nothing happened. The vehicles sat silently with their engines running, and Blake found himself holding his breath. Then, simultaneously, doors began opening on all three vehicles. From the lead vehicle stepped a man who was obviously in charge. He was wearing a full military dress uniform that made Whitmore's impressive outfit look almost casual by comparison. The uniform was deep red with gold braiding, perfectly pressed, and decorated with medals and insignia that spoke of serious military service. Even from a distance, Blake could see that this was someone who commanded respect, but it was what happened next that really caught everyone's attention. From the other vehicles emerged 6 soldiers in the full ceremonial dress of the Queen's Guard, red tunics, black trousers with red stripes, and those unmistakable tall black bearskin hats that every tourist in London recognized. These weren't actors or reenactors. These were the real thing. The crowd let out a collective gasp as the guards formed up in perfect military formation. Blake had seen the changing of the guard ceremony at Buckingham Palace on television, but seeing these soldiers up close was completely different. Their movements were precise, their bearing was flawless, and their presence commanded immediate respect. The officer in charge approached Blake and Riley with the confident stride of someone used to being in control of situations. As he got closer, Blake could see more details of his uniform, colonel's insignia, service ribbons that suggested combat experience, and the kind of bearing that came from years of military command. "Officers," the colonel said in a crisp military voice, "I am Colonel Morrison, commanding officer of Her Majesty's Household Division. I believe you have been speaking with Captain Whitmore regarding his detention this evening." Blake found himself unconsciously straightening his posture as he replied, "Yes, sir, Colonel Morrison. I'm Officer Blake, and this is Officer Riley. We stopped Captain Whitmore for a traffic violation and became concerned about some items in his vehicle." Colonel Morrison nodded approvingly. "Officers Blake and Riley, I want to commend you for your diligence and professionalism in this matter. You followed proper procedures when faced with an unusual situation, and that speaks well of your training and judgment." The colonel's words helped ease some of Blake's anxiety, but he was still processing the sight of 6 Queen's Guards standing at attention on a London street corner. The crowd around them had grown even larger, with people pulling out phones to record what was obviously a once-in-a-lifetime sight. "Captain Whitmore," Colonel Morrison called out, "report your status." Whitmore stepped forward and saluted sharply. "Sir, I was detained while returning from the palace briefing. Officers Blake and Riley have conducted themselves professionally throughout this incident. The classified materials remain secure in my vehicle." Very good, Captain, Morrison replied, returning the salute. Sergeant Thompson, please secure Captain Whitmore's vehicle and prepare the materials for transport. One of the Queen's guards stepped forward and began a careful inspection of Whitmore's car. Blake watched in fascination as the sergeant handled the documents and other materials with obvious expertise. This wasn't someone playing dress-up. This was a trained professional. Dealing with sensitive government information, Riley leaned over to Blake and whispered, "I don't think we're in Kansas anymore." Colonel Morrison turned back to the two police officers. "Officers, I must ask for your understanding regarding the sensitive nature of Captain Whitmore's assignment this evening. He was returning from a classified security briefing that involved matters of national importance." Blake nodded, still trying to process everything that was happening. "Colonel Morrison, we had no way of knowing that Captain Whitmore was legitimate. We've dealt with people impersonating officials before." "Of course you have," Morrison replied with understanding. "And you were absolutely right to be suspicious. A healthy skepticism is essential in both police work and military security. However, I hope this evening has demonstrated that not all uniforms are costumes, and not all claims of official duty are fabrications." The crowd was now completely captivated by the scene unfolding before them. People were taking photos and videos of the Queen's Guards, probably posting them to social media with captions about witnessing a real royal security operation. Blake realized that this incident would probably end up on the evening news. As the guards continued their work, Colonel Morrison explained more about Whitmore's role and the nature of his duties. "Captain Whitmore is one of our most experienced officers, with over 20 years of service to the Crown. This evening's briefing involves security arrangements for an upcoming state visit, which is why the materials in his possession are classified at the highest levels." Blake was starting to understand the gravity of what had happened. "Sir, are we in trouble for detaining Captain Whitmore?" Morrison smiled slightly. "On the contrary, officers. You did exactly what you should have done when faced with an unusual situation. The fact that you verified his identity through proper channels before releasing him shows excellent judgment. We would much rather deal with cautious police officers than careless ones." The sergeant working on Whitmore's vehicle approached Colonel Morrison and spoke quietly in his ear. Morrison nodded and turned back to the police officers. "Officers Blake and Riley, the materials have been secured, and Captain Whitmore is cleared to continue with his duties. However, I must ask that you treat the details of this evening's incident with appropriate discretion." Blake understood what the colonel was saying. "Of course, sir. We'll file our reports according to standard procedure, but we understand the sensitive nature of what happened here." As the guards prepared to leave, Colonel Morrison shook hands with both officers. "Gentlemen, thank you for your service to the community, and thank you for handling this unusual situation with such professionalism. The Crown appreciates dedicated public servants like yourselves." Whitmore approached Blake and Riley before getting back in his car. "Officers, I want to personally thank you for your patience this evening. I know this was an unusual situation, and you handled it exactly as you should have. Your commitment to proper procedure, even in difficult circumstances, is commendable." As the convoy prepared to leave, Blake watched the Queen's Guards file back into their vehicles with the same precision they had shown when arriving. The crowd was still recording, probably not quite believing what they had just witnessed on an ordinary London street. The vehicles pulled away as smoothly as they had arrived, leaving Blake and Riley standing next to their patrol cars, trying to process what had just happened. The crowd began to disperse, people excitedly talking about what they had seen and sharing their videos and photos. "Well," Riley said finally, "that's definitely going in the report?" Blake nodded, already dreading the paperwork involved in explaining this incident to his supervisor. "I don't think anyone's going to believe this story, even with all the video evidence." As they got back in their patrol car, Blake realized that this would probably be the most unusual traffic stop of his entire career. It was also a reminder that in a city like London, you never knew who you might encounter on any given night, even someone whose job it was to protect the most famous family in the world.